Well, thanks, Liz, and thanks everybody for answering those questions. Like she said, it's helpful for me to know a little bit where the background of everybody is in the meeting now, and then also for us to know where to shoot for future webinars too. So it's always good to get that feedback, and it's always interesting to see how it's shifting, especially with the cloud and Azure processing, Azure platforms out there, becoming more and more mature, more people moving there. It's definitely a changing environment. So those are great feedback there. So today, though, we're going to talk about Introduction to Azure SQL Database. So as the title kind of insinuates, we're going to stay pretty high level in this topic and just do an introduction to Azure SQL DB, talk about what it is and get you started in Azure SQL DB, help you kind of see if it's a fit for your organization or not. Just first, I'll introduce myself. I'm Brad Gall. I'm a lead consultant here with PragmaticWorks. If anybody has questions after this webinar, feel free to reach out to me or Liz, and I can either maybe find some time to reply or get you pointed in the right direction for someone that can answer these questions. I also blog at bradgall.com, a little bit at least, and then you can follow me on Twitter at bradgallsql as well. A little bit more. I am I've been working with SQL, SharePoint, and Microsoft BI for over 10 years now. Started back with what was it, SharePoint 2003 and SQL 2000, upgraded to 2005. I like to speak at user groups and webinars whenever I get a chance. It's helpful to stay up with the latest technologies and keep conversation going for myself, and it's just interesting to get out there in the community and share and teach. When I'm not doing that, I'm chasing the rugrats, so you can see a picture of my family there on the right. That pretty much takes up most of my time outside of work, so they're great, but a lot of work at the same time. And then I reside in Jacksonville, Florida. So me and my family actually moved here about 6 months ago, and we're loving sunny Florida so far. And the last thing I'll say is I'm a diehard Packer fan. So that's for everybody here in the Jacksonville office. Packers versus Jaguars is coming up week 1, so I had to add that to the slide there. So our agenda today, we're going to start off with just what is an Azure SQL DB. Just talk about, get us all on the same baseline, really what that is. A really good way to do that is to compare it to the other SQL platforms we have available. Everybody is probably pretty familiar with the traditional SQL. I mentioned SQL 2005, the on-prem version of SQL. So we'll do a comparison and see how Azure SQL DB compares to that, and hopefully that helps you make a decision of whether it's a good fit for you or not, and whether where to use Azure SQL DB and when not to use Azure SQL DB. We're going to then look at the Azure portal and create an Azure SQL database. I've got a demo with that. Really, you should be able to leave from this webinar and be able to go and kind of know how to go and start playing with Azure SQL DB, Azure in general, if you haven't started playing with it yet. There's actually ways to get in there for free and just start playing and learning and seeing kind of the capabilities and how easy some of this stuff is to set up. And then finally, we'll do a review of some of the Azure SQL DB features specifically, like how we can scale them up and down, what the high availability looks like, some of the performance and security, things like that. I actually probably have more material. I know I have a little bit more material than we can completely fit into this hour, so we'll wrap up with as much of the features as we can get through at the end as possible. Now, what is an Azure SQL DB? There's a lot of terms out there that you've probably heard. Really, the most basic way you could describe it is it's just a SQL database running in the Azure data centers with Microsoft. So it's just a SQL database that we can use that's running up in Azure. Another word you may have heard describe this, or another way to describe it would be it's a managed database service. So Microsoft is managing everything behind the database for you is another way to look at this. So you're going to get a hold of the database, but they're going to manage everything else for you. It's a database as a service is another way to say that same thing. So it's the database is being provided to you as a service from Microsoft, and a platform as a service is another term you could hear for that. So in this case, the platform is going to be the database, the SQL Server database, and it's being provided to you as a service from Microsoft again. And all those are great terms, and I think they help us understand what's going on, but really what does that mean in reality? What does, when the rubber hits the road, really what does all that mean to me? When I go to connect to this thing or I go to develop against it, what is that going to do for me, or why should I use this thing? I think the best way to do that is just take a look at how this thing compares to other SQL platforms, to our traditional SQL Server just running on a virtual machine, or SQL Server running on some hardware. And also, how does it compare to SQL Server running on a VM in Azure? Because that's another option we have. So to do that, we're going to take a look at the SQL flavors we have, the SQL platforms we have available to us. We're going to take a look at these top 4. So for our discussion's sake, we're going to look at SQL Server on-prem, directly on some hardware. Compare that to when we use SQL Server on-prem, but we started to virtualize our machines. We'll compare that to Azure SQL Server running on a VM. So that's another option. I think there's some confusion on the web sometimes when you first jump into Azure and you're looking to see what the capabilities are there with SQL. Part of that confusion comes from this stuff has changed quite a bit in the past 3 years. So we'll look at comparing the 2 options we have for running Azure, or running SQL Server in Azure, that being an Azure VM and an Azure SQL DB, which is the main focus of our topic today. Last, I just want to point out there are actually 2 other flavors of SQL Server that we're not going to get into today, but it's worth pointing out that they're out there. There was the on-prem version of what used to be called a SQL Server Parallel Data Warehouse. It was then rebranded, renamed as an APS. This would be like a large-scale distributed computing data warehouse type SQL Server, really built for the speed of analytics and answering large queries fast. We now just came out with general acceptance over the past 3 or 4 months. There's a Azure version of that as well called Azure SQL DW. And it's good to note that because as you're, again, doing some research, you may be Googling Azure SQL DB and you might come up with some Azure SQL DW hits out there. So it's good to know that there's actually a difference between those 2, a big difference actually, even though the names are very, very similar. Now to compare where Azure SQL DB fits within our architectures, we're going to take a look at this chart here. And really what we're trying to accomplish whenever we're looking to go to the cloud or we're looking to use these databases as a service is it's just an evolution of trying to share the cost of hardware and share the cost of administration for multiple databases for multiple databases. Basically, instead of having to do dedicated hardware costs and dedicated administration for each database I have, how can I offset that cost and spread it out over multiple machines and maybe multiple infrastructure teams? When we start that off, if we look at a physical server, just a physical server running on raw iron, a SQL instance running that. Really, this is going to be your highest dedicated cost and the highest amount of administration you have. Just because those 2 things are high does not necessarily mean that that's not an option. It's not something that you should be doing or that you need to do. A lot of, or maybe not a lot, but there are scenarios where you just have a really intense data cycling process you need to accomplish, and the best fit for you may be to stay on a physical box with 64, 256 CPUs and as much RAM as you can stuff in that box, and just get that raw power out of that. That's going to be something that may be the best fit for you. If that's the best fit for what your workload looks like, Azure SQL DB is probably not going to be something you're going to try and use for that workload. Now, as we go up from there, what has started to happen over the past, well, this has been happening for a while now, over 10, 20 years, infrastructures have started to virtualize servers. So we started with just virtualizing a lot of our web boxes, the things that weren't necessarily utilizing all the hardware that they were sitting on, combining them together and maybe taking 20 servers and combining them all onto three hardware hosts. So 3 hosts of hardware running 20 servers. As that process matured again, a lot of shops started to, and are right now, virtualizing SQL servers to accomplish the same thing. So again, maybe we have 10 SQL servers and running on 5 hosts in a virtualized environment. This starts to save us on our administration costs, so hopefully we're not having to support as many hardwares and rack and stacking as many servers with this. And it also saves us on the hardware costs there, just having to not have to buy as many separate HBA cards for connecting to our SANs, things like that. Now, probably the reason most of you are here for an introduction to Azure is the next step up, which would be infrastructure as a service or an Azure VM running SQL Server in the cloud. So as we go up on our chart with this, we are starting to offset our costs even more. So now we're not having to even manage the hosts anymore. All we're managing is the VM, so the OS and the SQL instance in Azure, but we are not administering a SAN anymore. We're not administering the hosts, maybe the virtual machines, either the Hyper-V or the VMware hosts. We don't have to have staff on hand that would have to understand VMware well and the intricacies of all the high availability and everything there, and the licensing costs, all that goes with that. That's a primary reason for looking into moving those VMs up into Azure, and again, reducing that cost because we're sharing it across Microsoft's data centers. And then last but not least, as we go up, we have Azure SQL databases as an option. So these are now virtualized databases. So we've taken out the administration of running an OS. We've taken out the administration of even managing the SQL instance itself. It's right at the platform as a service level now. And again, this may be a good fit or not a good fit for you, depending on what your workload is. So if there's things within the SQL instance itself that I need to control that are very specific to my app, or I'm doing things like CLR integration, or I'm just doing some maybe really intricate stuff with the SQL agents, maybe the SQL Azure DB is not the best fit for you to go to the cloud with your database, and maybe going with an Azure VM running SQL Server would be the better fit there. So that's kind of how these all fit together. And really, as you look at most enterprises, you're not going to be able to move all of your SQL into one of these buckets or not. You're going to use some kind of hybrid of the four of these within your organization. And really, again, it just takes an analysis of what your workload is and really looking at what you're trying to accomplish with SQL in your infrastructure. So now we've covered all the SQL flavors. Really today we're here to talk about Azure. Let's take a look at the two Azure variants for running SQL Server a little bit closer. So I mentioned we have virtual machines for SQL Server, and we have Azure SQL DB. If we compare the way these two things run to each other, with a SQL VM, we get full control of the SQL instance and full control of the OS. So with the SQL VM, it's really a virtual machine we're running in Azure. We have full control of the OS, so we can connect it to our Active Directory. We can set up our own group policies. We have full control over that. We also have full control of the SQL instance, so we can install the instance ourselves. We could actually use one of the images that Microsoft gives you up in Azure and have the license built in with that. And have it pre-installed for us as when we create it, which saves us a lot of time there as well, but still gives us control over that instance. When we compare that to Azure SQL Database, we don't have that control anymore, so we're not able to control the OS or instance settings. But what we do get is savings on the admin costs of that SQL Server and OS. So with Azure SQL DB, I'm not having to set up high availability groups. I'm not setting up always on availability groups. I may or may not have to worry about database backups depending on what our SLAs are for the backups. Azure SQL DB has a lot of backup capabilities built in for us. Things like that, I just don't have to get into that low level setup anymore just to run a database. Now, a good fit for IaaS or SQL VMs running in Azure is if we need to quickly migrate to Azure. So we're looking to, our hardware is starting to get a little bit old. We really need to get a good plan to get our existing SQL infrastructure up into Azure. SQL VMs might be a better fit than Azure SQL Database because there's a lot of times some things that are written into our code or written into our processes that just really need that whole SQL instance. And if you have staff on hand already that are doing it, SQL VMs, again, may be a good fit for you. With Azure SQL DB, it may require some code rewrite to migrate over to SQL DBs. So if your existing database is utilizing, again, some of those features, you may have to do some rewrites to get it up there, or you may not. So one of the things to do is to analyze your database, see which one of these two options it could fit in, and go with the one that's the best fit again. With SQL VMs, really it's going to be a better fit for larger databases or, again, the highly customized DB environment because of the control you get. Azure SQL DB is probably a better fit if you're getting to larger databases. It's a better fit for smaller DBs. So there is a limit right now of 1 terabyte and that's only in the highest premium tier for Azure SQL DB for the size of the database. It's come a long way from when it started. I believe many years ago when it first came out, it was about 15 gigs or so, something like that, that an Azure SQL DB could run. But we've come a long way. We're up to 1 terabyte now. But again, if you're trying to run multi-terabyte database, Azure SQL DB is not going to be the best fit for you there. What it is a good fit for, though, is things like multi-tenant applications, or if you have a software as a service application where you're separating your client's data across databases. Azure SQL DB is actually built really, really well for that, because you can have it spin up the databases very quickly. Each database is separated from the others so that you can keep the multi-tenancy separated there. And they've actually started to build some features in, like what you'll hear is elastic database pools, where you can run those multi-tenant databases in a pool together and kind of offset the cost of each database there too. So that's an area where they would be a great fit. So now we've talked about what Azure is and hopefully laid the groundwork of where it kind of can fit in your database infrastructure. Let's go ahead and talk about creating our first Azure SQL DB. So let's get into the technical details for an Azure SQL DB. And really it's pretty simple. It's some new terms, a new way of thinking, a new way of doing things when you get into the Azure portal, but pretty straightforward once you get used to everything. Really there's 3 things you need to know about to create your first database. They're here on the screen. So the first would be a resource group. With this being the intro, I'm not going to get very deep into what resource groups are into Azure, but really you can think of them as a logical way to group objects that are created in Azure. So everything you create in Azure, at least in the new portal, is associated to a resource group, and what that does is allow you to track them, track the costs on them, track whether or not you want to delete them out, things like that. So you can set up test resource groups and just and segment out the groups of objects you have available in Azure SQL DB. We're also going to need to know and pick a pricing tier for Azure SQL DB. So the way they do, the way they allocate the hardware with Azure SQL Database is behind the scenes they're really using a governor on the infrastructure that they have in place, and they're governing down the individual databases based on the pricing tier that you pick. The way they communicate to you how much your database has as far as resources is something called a DTU. These DTUs are really just a way, again, for them, it's a database transaction unit, I believe. I might have misspoke that acronym, but it's really just a way for you to see how many resources am I using versus how many of this database has been allocated based on the pricing tier I'm in. They are not specific to say like you get 2 gigahertz of CPU and you get 100 IOPS of throughput per DTU. They tried to line them up that way in the fact that they are linear, meaning if I have a database with 50 DTUs and I have a database with 25 DTUs, the 50 DTU database should have twice the performance of the 25 DTU database. So the scale there they've created is a linear scale, and they should remain static as the product is growing. So as we're adding, Microsoft is constantly adding new pricing tiers, and they're growing what the capabilities are of Azure SQL DB. They just, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, they just released a new premium tier with, I think, 3,000 DTUs, something like that. We'll see it when we get into the portal. But that 3,000 still compares to the 5 DTUs that you see on the basic tier. And then last thing we're going to need to pick when we create our Azure SQL database would be a Azure SQL Server. I'm going to use air quotes around SQL Server because really this is just a logical server within the Azure environment that this database is going to tie to. It's not actually an instance. You don't get all the capabilities of the instance, but it acts like an instance when you're connecting to the database. So this is where we will set up our firewall. This is where we tell Azure which data center we should store our databases in, because it'll be tied to this server. Really, it's just a logical grouping and a logical connection to our databases in Azure. And we're going to hop to a demo here next, but after we create it, you got to think about how you're going to connect to Azure SQL DB. And the nice thing is that all of the common SQL Server tools are available now to connect to Azure SQL databases. So we can connect with Management Studio. You're going to connect to it just like you would connect to a database that you have on-prem. Actually, it might be a little bit easier because once we'll see how you punch through the firewall in Azure, you can connect to it from connections outside of your network firewall. Maybe a little bit easier. You're not going to have to deal with the setting up VNets or any of the networking that you'd have to otherwise. We can also connect with Visual Studio, so we can create a database project and connect it to our Azure SQL database and have everything under source control and deploy our changes out there to Azure SQL DB, just again like we could do on-prem. PowerShell is the name of the game with Azure, so we can automate these things and administer our database with PowerShell there too. And then it's also important to note that Azure SQL DB supports from the web front end multi-platforms too, so we can connect a Ruby app or a Perl app or obviously a C# app to our Azure SQL DB, and it supports all those connectivities. So with that, let's hop on over and do a demo, get into the portal and see how we create that. So I'll just mention real briefly, just for sake of time, I'm not going to go through how to do it, but if you go to visualstudio.com, you can actually get a free subscription for Azure just to play with. You get $25 a month of Azure spend just by signing up for it. They do ask for your credit card, but you can set it up. Actually, it defaults to not charging your card when your $25 is up. It just pauses all of your resources, and that's actually what I'm using today, just to spin up and show what we're doing here. Obviously, if you have MSDN, you get a little bit more resources. It's tied to that. It ties to your MSDN subscription too. And then if you're an enterprise agreement or if you work with Microsoft, you're going to set up some subscriptions in Azure and connect to that. I already have a subscription set up, and if I just go to portal.azure.com, that's how you connect and manage your Azure resources. So you can see I've already logged in with my account, so it logged me in automatically here. And I get this heads-up dashboard of everything that I've created out here in my subscription right now. Move this out of the way. You can see I have $22 left so far for this month. I can see some of the resources I've been using here lately. Real quickly, we'll take a look over here on the left-hand side. This gives you a list of basically everything that I can create in Azure. And that's freaking out a little bit. So this gives me a list of everything I can create in Azure. I could create some data factories. SQL databases is where we'll look today. Virtual machines is where I would go to create a SQL virtual machine. You can click there real quick and show you. They actually have some templates for SQL databases. So right here you can see one of the templates they have is the SQL Server 2006 template to set up a SQL database in Azure, or SQL Server in Azure, I should say. We're going to click on SQL databases here, and you can see I already have a few databases out here in my subscription. One way I could add a new database would be to click this Add button here at the top, or the other way I could add one is by clicking on the New button up here above all those resources, and if I click on Data plus Storage, I get a list of all of the featured apps within that marketplace, and SQL database is the top option there. Now, they call these blades in Azure. It just opened up a new blade for me to create a new SQL database. So let's give this a name. We'll call it WebinarDB. So that's going to be my database name. My subscription is my developer free subscription. I mentioned our resource groups. So this, again, is going to be the group of it's just a container, you can think of it as, to store this database in. I could also store web apps in it, so I could put a container with my web app and my SQL database together so I could see those together easily in Azure. So we'll create a new one too. We'll call this webinar group. I have a few options for source here, so I could just create a blank database. That's probably what you're going to do if you're going to pump your database up there, or just pump some test data in there. I can create a sample database, which is what I'll do for our purposes right now. So this is just going to create an AdventureWorks database. And you also, so the third option is a backup. Let me just click on that and show you that for a second. Jumping ahead a little bit, but I could create a database based off of a backup that Azure is creating for me from the databases I have in existence. So these are the three databases we saw on the previous screen, and I could click on this one, for instance, and it would it would restore a copy of that database into this new database name for me if I wanted to do that. I'm going to switch this back to sample for now. And then my next option here is for the server. So again, this is the logical SQL server that this database will be a part of. I already have 2 logical servers within my subscription. Let's go ahead and create another one though. We'll call this webinar SQL server. And you just got to give it a login name. So this is the name I'm going to use to log into the SQL database or SQL server. Confirm it. And I have to pick a location. For the location, this is going to be the the Microsoft data center where this database is going to reside. We have a few options here. Really, you just want to pick, obviously, the one that's closest maybe to your users or your current data center, just to cut down on latency. So I'm going to pick East US 2. Last option on this screen is whether or not to create it with the version 12 server. Version 12 servers came out this year around the same time as SQL 2016. They're the latest version of Azure SQL DBs, and they support most of the features within the database of a SQL 2016 database. So if you have code running in a SQL 2016 database, it should be supported to run it in Azure SQL database, again within that database container. So let's click select on that. And that selected that server. And then the last option I have is I need to pick a pricing tier. So this is where the DTUs come into play. You can see there's a lot of options. If I scroll down, we see we have a basic option. We have some standard options with S0, 1, 2, and 3. And we have some premium tier. So really, as you go up the chart, you see the prices go up. Really, we're deciding how much performance I need to get out of this database. This is really it's really a performance decision, a little bit for how many connections and how much size you need. So you can see in the premium tier you can get 500 gigabytes per database. In the standard tier you get 250 gigabytes per database. There's only one premium that now goes up to a terabyte in size if you need that. And there's also some connection limits which you can look up on the Azure documentation. What you'll also notice, though, is that all of them have the same feature set. So we get auditing, we get point-in-time restore, we get geo-replication with each of the different tiers here. So the feature set is actually the same across all the different pricing tiers. It's the performance gain that you get, the performance that you need is how you pick which pricing tier you'd like. I'm going to just pick, let's just pick an S1 for our purposes right now. And we'll click create. I'll also go ahead and check pin to dashboard here. You can see what that does, and we'll click create. Oops, sorry, let me cancel that. I need to click select on my database tier first, and then I'll click create. Now that's deploying my SQL database as we speak. Because I picked for it to show the tile on my dashboard, I'm seeing it right here on my front page. This is an old one that I don't need anymore, so I could delete that. You can see how those tiles work. That should only take a couple minutes to create, excuse me, but while it's creating, let's go take a look at our database and really how we'll connect to that once it's done. So if I go back over to my SQL databases on the left-hand side here, again we see the list of databases we saw before. I'm going to connect to this baseball layman 2014 database. When I click on that, we get a new blade for our database, and we can see some options for looking at administrating this database. So I get a quick overview as the first blade. You can see they give me a monitoring chart, so I'm seeing how much percentage of DTU I'm using at any given point in time across that database. So this is a good way to see if you're ready to go up to the next level maybe, because you're starting to peg this database quite a bit. You get activity log, you can tag these things. I want to look at the connectivity first. So I'm on this database. You can see also the server name that the database is connected to. So in this instance, my logical SQL server name is study SQL server.database.windows.net. And at the top of this, you'll see set server firewall. Now if I want to connect to this database, I need to tell Azure that my IP address is allowed to come in and connect to this database. It's the first line of defense against anybody getting to my data. And if I click on that set firewall rules, you see I have a couple options here. The first is being whether or not I want to allow access to Azure SQL services. So a lot of times we'll leave that as yes. What this gives you is the ability for Power BI to come in and connect and refresh data coming out of your database. So that's a common scenario. We're putting Azure databases in the cloud, and it's a perfect marriage for reporting some data out of that with with Power BI. So with this being checked, that should allow Power BI to connect to this database. The next you can see are some firewall rules, basically allowing ranges of IP addresses to connect to this. One of the things it does do is there's this add client IP add, and see if I can get this to show up. Nope. So Zoom, it's not working great for me right now, but this add client IP button, if you click that, it's going to add the IP address that I'm currently connected to the Azure database with. So if you don't know your IP, again, and especially if you're just playing with this from home, you can click that, and it's going to add the IP address that I'm connected from right now. And I would click Save on that, and that would save that firewall rule. And now I should be able to go and connect to that database, assuming, again, that I have the username and login as well. So for the server name, if I hover over this, I can click the copy button. And let's go to Management Studio, and it's already connected, so let's kill that. And I'm just going to go connect to a database engine, just like I would any other database, and paste in that server name that I just copied out of Azure, and log in. And it should connect me up to my SQL Server in Azure now. So I can click on the list of databases. You see the two databases I have available on the server. So there's another one called StudyDB. This is the database we were just looking at. And I can now browse this database and query it. So let me change this connection to that one I just created here. And let's just run this. Oh, sorry, I need to change my context. And run that. So that's all it took to connect now. I'm pulling this data down from the cloud, and it's rendering here on my local laptop and running like that. One thing I'd like to point out that kind of visualizes the difference between Azure SQL Database and running Azure or running SQL either in a VM or locally is you'll notice when I connect it to that database, I really only get two options. I just get the logins, so I can see the one login that I've created, and I get the databases. In contrast, I'm not getting everything that I would get with a local instance. So I'm missing the server objects and Polybase with 2016. I don't have anything for always-on high availability groups because I don't need to set any of those up. All that's being, again, handled for me, and I don't need to set any of that up. Let's hop back over to the portal now and look at the SQL databases. And you can see my webinar DB has now been created. If I came out to my portal homepage, you can see that the deploying has gone away, and now I can click on the SQL database. Now, just as a quick test, we have the database here. We have the server name there. Let's just go ahead and set a firewall rule on this. Because it's a brand new database, I don't have any firewall rules set yet. So I'm going to add my client IP, click Save, click OK, and I'm going to copy that server name again and connect. And just to show you, it was probably maybe about 5 minutes or so, and we have a database created. I need to give it my username and password, don't I? We have a database created in the cloud that we can connect to and start using. So it's big time savings from having to rack and stack a server, install an OS, install a instance, create the databases, put all of our standards on there, set up high availability. All that's already been done for us. So that's really the big gain with Azure SQL DB is just the time to get everything set up and running is greatly reduced there. Let's hop back over to the slide deck now. So I want to talk about a few more things now about the features for Azure SQL DB. The demo we just did was creating a blank database, and there's a lot of options for migrating your SQL database that you currently have on-premise up to Azure SQL DB. Really, this is just a list of it. I wanted to point out, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here for sake of time, but we do have a webinar coming up. I believe it's on October 4th, where a friend of mine, another consultant, Bob Rubaki, is going to talk about the intricacies a little bit of migrating data up to SQL DB. So he's going to go through these different scenarios with you and the nuances of those. So mark that on your calendars if you're interested in this. But we have an option. There's in SQL Server Management Studio, if you're connected to a database, there's a wizard you can right-click and run, and it'll upgrade or upload your data up to a database in Azure. I wouldn't do that for a really large database, but it's something, again, you can do the quick and dirty way for a small database to play with things up there. We can export and import backpacks. We can export a backpack, just get the data schema out of it, and then maybe import our data with BCP files. So we could BCP maybe some large tables out into flat files, pump them up to Azure, and then import them into our database if we're getting to some large sizes and things like that. And last, we can also set up transactional replication. So you can set up an Azure SQL database as an endpoint or as part of your replication schema and replicate the data up to Azure if that's a scenario that works for you. But for now, let's take a look at the Azure SQL DB features that we have available and talk about what these look like. So we're going to talk about three different things. We're going to talk about scale on demand and elastic database pools and how those things look. And we're going to talk about high availability, really how the high availability works within Azure SQL Database. And Azure SQL DB also gives us some performance and monitoring and tuning capabilities built right into that Azure portal that we were just in. Let's do this. So for Azure SQL DB scale, for those pricing tiers we saw, I already explained the DTUs. The thing I haven't talked about yet is the fact that when I pick that DTU out the gate, I'm not tied to that pricing scale from then going forward. I can scale those on the fly. I could actually go into that database and change the tier that I'm in, and it's actually a very minimal downtime, and it migrates my database up to that new database tier. Again, because it's really a governor behind the scenes, it might have to migrate and switch you over to one of the other database copies that it has running in Azure, but for the most part, it's a very minimal downtime, like a blip on the scale, and it moves you over to a new scale. So I can scale this thing up and down as I need to. So maybe as it's growing, I have 3 or 4 months where I know I'm going to have some high utilization. I could scale this up to a higher tier, and then as things start to slow down, I could drop it down to another tier. Very simple. We could do that right within the Azure portal. I'm going to just mention this. This is something to keep in mind, again, because of time today, but there's also elastic database pools. What those do is they take the idea of a DTU and they pull them together into what they call eDTUs, where basically I can say, hey, I have these 10 databases, I'm going to pool them together, I'm going to pick how many DTUs I need for those 10 databases as a whole, I'm going to pay for that, as opposed to having to pick a particular scale for each one of those databases. So maybe I have 10 databases and it's kind of hard to tell which 5 of those at any point are really going to be using the most resources. They kind of ebb and flow in an unpredictable pattern. That's where the elastic database pools come into play, and these are again, a great option for multi-tenancy apps. I could group together 25 client databases in a pool. I could scale the pool as I need to versus having to manage the scale of each individual database. Skip that demo at the moment. I'm going to go through the slides for these and then hop back over to the portal and walk you through these features there. So the next thing we get with Azure SQL Database is high availability features built in. So with the built-in high availability is Azure always maintains 3 copies of the database at any given point in time. It does this, again, for all the different pricing tiers, and it does it automatically. So when I created that study database, it created 3 copies of it for me in Azure. This will protect you from catastrophic hardware failure on the Microsoft side. Another thing, the good thing to point out here with the high availability that I don't have in the slide is Microsoft gives you an SLA of 4 nines. So you get a 99.99% high availability SLA for Microsoft on Azure SQL Database. Another thing I get built in with Azure SQL DB is built-in backups. So I can restore to a point in time from anything within Azure SQL Database, any databases I have running on Azure SQL DB. And finally, there's an option for geo-replication. So within a matter of clicks, I can create a read-only copy of my database in another data center within Microsoft. So if my SLA internally requires that I need some geo-replication to handle the possibility of, the unlikely possibility of something happening to that entire Microsoft data center, I can geo-replicate it. Again, it's only a matter of clicks, and Microsoft handles the setup there. With the cost on that, really what you're going to pay for is just another copy of that database. It sets up the copy, the replicated copy, at the same pricing tier that the primary copy is set up with. With the Azure SQL DB Performance, they give you some cool features that are actually pretty new. I misspelled performance there. It gives you the SQL Database Advisor built in. So we'll hop over here next into the portal again and take a look at that. And it gives you some query performance insight too. Part of that is also index recommendations. So within the portal, within the GUI there, it's going to monitor your queries and show you, hey, here's some indexes maybe that you should probably add to help with your query performance. And here's your worst performing queries. Here's some recommendations on that. It'll also tell you recently that, hey, you have duplicate indexes. I know this is a common scenario in a lot of shops where you're running indexes that are actually duplicates of other indexes. You don't even realize it. What Azure SQL DB will do is monitor for that and give you a heads up that that is happening on one of your tables. Now, Azure SQL Database Security, this is actually came back in the poll as one of the concerns with going to SQL. This is becoming better and better all the time. I really feel like it's become a matured product at this point for security in Azure. We already saw the firewall that's there that's protecting your database. We have to actually add our IP address to connect to it. What they also give you is some threat detection. So what this is doing is they're actually kind of, you have to turn on auditing for it to work, but it's going to monitor your auditing traffic and look out for abnormal connections and give you alerts based off of, hey, this weird IP address or the strange set of queries is running on your database. You should probably go check that out and see what's going on. That again gets turned on with just a matter of clicks, and it monitors for you and sends you alerts on that. A few new things, again, that just came out is Azure Active Directory integration. So prior to this month, we had to use SQL logins to connect to Azure SQL Database. We now just recently are now able to use Windows authentication to authenticate against an Azure or an Active Directory login. So you can maintain your logins in Active Directory instead of on each database. Again, something that actually brings it up to the maturity level I think a lot of us would expect before going there. So that's just, it's great that they got that out there for us to use within Azure SQL Database. That also applies to Azure SQL Data Warehouse if anybody's looking into that as well. They also added Always Encrypted. So Always Encrypted was a feature they added in SQL 2016, which keeps your connection encrypted at all times. They've added that to Azure SQL Database. They've implemented transparent data encryption. So this is again something else that we had on on-prem version of SQL Database. We now have this available on Azure. So this is going to keep the log files, the database files, everything that's stored on disk within the Azure data center encrypted. So if someone somehow or another did get a hold of my database file within the Microsoft data center, it's going to be an encrypted file that they're not going to be able to get a hold of or be able to decrypt. And then lastly, there's a data masking was introduced in SQL on-prem, I want to say in 2016, maybe a little bit before that, but again, within the GUI, within Azure Portal, we can set up data masking on columns within tables within our Azure SQL database. So let's go ahead and hop over our portal and take a look at what a few of those things look like. So I'm going to connect to, let's just go ahead and use the baseball database that I had out there. We're going to click on that database again. We'll see the overview. We should see a small spike where I ran that query earlier. This is a pretty small priced database, so running that query spiked up my CPU a little bit there and my DTUs. So again, that's where the monitoring is built in for us there. Now on the pricing scale, if I click this pricing scale, and this is currently running as just a basic, which with basic is that's only going to be for playing with databases. You're never going to run an actual database you have clients or any real production thing connecting to off of basic. If I wanted to bump that up though, and say I'm going to bump that up to an S0. So I could click S0 and click select. You'll see the database scale request is received. It pops up in the alerts. This tells you what, the alerts tell you what you've been doing as you've been clicking around within the portal. And you can see that scale request has been received. Within a matter of minutes here, it's going to have it scaled up, and that database will now be running with more GTUs than it had before. So that's all it takes to scale up and down my databases here within Azure. Geo-replication I mentioned. So for high availability sake, right now I have those 3 local copies that Azure gives you for free, basically, with within the cost of that database. I can also set up secondary geo-replications, and I mentioned that this was actually pretty easy to set up. To do it, I have my East 2 region right now. I'm just going to put this over on the West Coast. So maybe I have some West Coast users. This is kind of like some reporting data that they need to connect to, and the latency is getting a little bad coming from the West Coast to the East Coast. And I'm going to set up a read-only copy of that. Target server, we'll just use a server I have already. It's readable secondary. Pricing tier, I'll pick the pricing tier. Is basic still because that's still being upgraded. So we'll select that, and I'll click OK. And with that now, you'll see it's submitting the deployment, and it's going to go and deploy that database out into that other data center for me. And I'll be able to connect to that server now, sitting in that region, and run. It's a read-only secondary. I can run queries off of that. This could also be used for disaster recovery. If something happened in that East 2 data center, I could fail over to my West 2 data center. And I got a failure, I think probably because I was in the middle of upgrading my tier when I did that too. That's probably what this is going to say. So let's back out of that and go here. And I'll just show you this a database that I've already done this on. I'm pretty sure it did that because I was clicking a little fast. I did the DTU upgrade and the high availability all at the same time without it waiting for it to complete. That's where I got that error from. But if I look at this database, you can see I have a West Coast and an East Coast copy of this database up and running. Here in the last few minutes, I'll just go through a few more of these. So we did that. Audit and threat detection, again, is just going to be a setting here within the portal. I can turn on auditing, so it's going to maintain audit logs of everybody that's been accessing my database, and I can turn on threat detection once I have those turned on. I can manage this at the server level too if I want. That logical server is where I'm managing it on this database, and it's going to apply down to all the databases on that server. Dynamic data masking, again, here within the portal is where I can add masks to my different columns here within the database and use some dynamic data masking with that. Transparent data encryption, again, right here. I can just turn this on and it'll encrypt my data transparently to my application is where the transparent comes from, and go with there. And then last, before I hop over for a few minutes of questions, would be the troubleshooting and support. So down here under the performance overview, this is where it's going to show you the performance recommendations it's making for you as it's watching your workload run. So I haven't run a lot of workload on this database. This StudyDB is actually just an AdventureWorks copy. But if I did have some stuff here, you'd see the top queries that we're running. It gives you some auto-tuning recommendations as things run. The 2 tabs below that are a breakout of that overview. So it'll give you the list of recommendations that is made for you and the history of those, and then query performance insight. So here, if I click on these queries, this is going to be some background processes that are running, but it'll actually give you a view of the query that's running and let you see what the queries were that were the worst offenders on your database. So with that, I knew I was going to be tight on time for this, but I'll see if there's any questions. And if not, I'll try to get them answered and maybe get them out on my blog. But yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to read them off to you, or you want me to make you see?
Yeah, if you have them and you can read some off, that'd be perfect.
Yeah. All right. I'm just going to start at the top. What mechanism would you recommend to schedule tasks within Azure SQL Database? Something that analogs to SQL jobs.
So there's a few ways you could do it. You could do One way I know some people do it is if you still have on-prem premise, or if you still have on-prem presence, you can use the SQL agent on a local server to run jobs against databases in the cloud. So that's one easy way to do it still until they get some kind of agent job up there. If not, there's Azure resources. Trying to think of the specific names of them. There's Data Factory. We could use Data Factory maybe to schedule some stuff there, or just like web jobs, things like that.
Okay. Do you use SQL Management Studio on the non-OS version?
Yes. So Management Studio connects to any flavor of SQL Server that we have. We could connect it to Azure SQL DB. We could connect it to Azure SQL DW even. It's fully supports all of them.
All right. Sorry, I'm scrolling through. How do you add an IP from behind a corporate firewall?
It's going to be the IP of your firewall when that's the case. This is going to be the IP address that Azure is going to see. So if you're logged in your corporate firewall and you connect to an Azure portal, it's going to see whatever IP address is being presented to Azure. So it would add the corporate firewall IP for you. Actually, I'm in the Pragmatic Works office right now. When I just did that demo, it's actually adding the IP address of the firewall we have here.
You mentioned that DTUs would remain static over time. Previously, Microsoft had stated that DTUs would grow over time to become more powerful for the same price. Has that changed?
I believe so. So as they're growing, they're staying the same in the fact that the linear capability stays the same. So the hardware behind the scenes may grow, and 5 DTUs may get to be a little bit stronger than it was previously. The thing is to keep in mind that as they're growing, they're not going to keep pace to where a 10 DTU server is going to suddenly, not suddenly, but even grow enough to be a viable option for you over time. It's pretty much going to remain the same as far as what capabilities it gives you, and they're adding more larger size DTU pricing tiers to the end to grow this up.
Is cross-database querying allowed between databases on the same SQL server?
So currently, technically, it's not. They have in preview an option called Elastic Query. So it's a new option that's out this year. It's in preview, and with it, you can do a query across multiple databases. That's specifically targeted, it looks like, for the multi-tenant capabilities of keeping your schema up to date across all of your databases, things like that. And I have no idea when it's going to go public, but I know it's out there in preview right now.
Can we scale down DTUs, or are we committed once we go up a tier?
Yep, you can scale up or down however you like. So you can scale up on the fly. I could also just scale that back down to the basic tier, which I'll probably do after this webinar, actually.
Someone wants to know how SSRS and SSIS incorporate.
So Azure SQL Database is just the database container itself. There's not going to be an SSRS or an SSIS presence here. That would be if you need those two things, that's going to be when you need to use the Azure SQL virtual machine within Azure. Unfortunately, they don't really have the BI stuff available as a platform as a service yet. You're going to have to use the infrastructure as a service for those pieces.
Okay. I think we have time for at least one more. I have jobs that run nightly using SQL Server Agent. Is this not allowed with Azure?
So it's allowed with Azure VMs, so that would be another option I didn't answer with the question earlier. You could also set up an Azure VM if you really need the SQL agent and you're used to that, and have it run the jobs as a central management server against Azure SQL databases. So again, you can run Azure jobs against databases, we don't have the agent running within Azure SQL database logical servers.
Do one more. How can we set up a continuous data transfer from SQL Azure to an on-premises solution?
So from Azure SQL down to the on-prem, there are a lot of options there. You could use SSIS to create a package to pull the data down If you're looking at it, doing it for backup capabilities, one of the features I didn't get a chance to get into was the fact that I can export that Azure SQL database into a backpack and pull it down to my on-prem. So I can export the whole database as a backpack and pull it down. If you wanted to, for some reason, pull it out of Azure SQL DB, you could do that. You could also do it for backup purposes. You could use SSIS to stream data down. We could use Data Factory, which is a Azure SQL kind of scheduling and data movement tool to pull it down. A lot of options there. So those were a few off the top of my head.
Well, we are a little past noon, so I think we'll go ahead and stop there. If you didn't get your question answered, I will send these to Brad and try and get him to do a blog for us so we can post that. And if you have any questions that you didn't get to put in the window, feel free to email me, Liz. I'll be happy to pass on any questions to Brad that may come. As always, this session was recorded, and you'll receive an email with the link to the recording tomorrow. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Brad, for hosting, and
Yep.
we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.